Welcome to the Own It Powercast, the place to be when you get serious about making big changes and accelerating growth in your life and in your relationships. Finally create the life you've always wanted, living life on your own terms. Learn how to take your fear and turn it into powerful choices that will create sustained change. Now your host, Mary Baker.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Own It Powercast, the place to come to get what you need to move yourself forward. Hey, it's Mary Baker and welcome to episode 258, The People-Pleasing Trap, Childhood Roots of Avoidance and Emotional Dishonesty. Well, welcome back to a new month, which has been all about getting things straight with ourselves, especially all the things we don't want to face or look at or deal with. In each week, we're going to look at different aspects of our tendencies to avoid the hard things, and ultimately, at the end of the day, ourselves. This week, I want to get into just why we might struggle with avoidance. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to last week's episode, make sure you check that out so we're all on the same page about what it means. What does avoidance really mean and look like? Because I know we can all at times struggle with not wanting to deal with hard things. But what we're talking about this month is really just the patterns of avoidance, the type of avoidance that's a bit more entrenched and has bigger impacts on our life and our relationships. But first, we can't work on avoidance or ourselves without working on boundaries. So if you struggle with those, make sure you check out the mini course that I have. It's an ebook with some podcast episodes in there so you can listen and you can look and you can do the worksheets and you can really get a great head start on your boundary work. If you want more, I have a 3-part masterclass, which is great. And it gets into how you lost your voice, what happened, and how to start really getting that back and getting your mojo going. Then if you really want to work on yourself and make some big changes in your life, check out the Find Your Voice course. That is a 12-module immersive experience that also includes really great online group coaching, which is a lot of fun, and personal coaching from me. And so you get lots of support, and you deserve that. And we can't do this work alone. I watch people try to do the work alone, and it just doesn't work. We need healthy environments to do the work, and we need the structure, and we need the love, and we need the guidance and the accountability. All right, so the people-pleasing trap. What are those childhood roots of avoidance? Like, where does this stuff come from? Because, again, like I talk about here all the time, 4-year-olds are not avoidant. They know what they feel, and they'll tell you they have no problem until they learn maybe that's not a great idea. So today we're going to look at the ways childhood experiences create patterns of avoidance in adulthood. We're going to explore how these early influences can lead to people-pleasing behaviors, lead to emotional dishonesty, and the tendency to suppress your feelings until they erupt in anger. So let's talk about how this happens. Like how childhood trauma and or neglect teaches avoidance as a coping mechanism. Childhood trauma or neglect can profoundly impact someone's emotional and psychological development. We know that. We talk about it here all the time. But I also think we can underestimate the impacts of our own childhood because for a lot of people, it's really hard, especially if they struggle with avoidance, to really look at their childhood. In fact, a colleague said the other day, he said, the people who said, I had a great childhood, often have some big avoidance issues because that's not realistic. It just isn't. Everyone probably had a bit of a mixed bag, some more mixed than others. But saying, oh, nothing happened, it was great, it was lovely, is avoidant. It's avoiding the negative things. It's avoiding looking at that. And so we're not going to go deep on this episode about trauma. There are other episodes on that. Check them out if you need to. But we just need to understand that childhood trauma can include physical, emotional, and or sexual abuse. And of course, we know with trauma, it's going to create some serious coping mechanisms, as can neglect. And I think neglect is neglected, right? We don't look at neglect as fiercely as we should. But what we're learning is that unmet needs are a big deal when it comes to impacts on someone's entire life. Neglect refers to the failure of your caregivers to provide basic physical, emotional, or educational needs. But it can also be emotional neglect and psychological neglect, like lack of attention, lack of love, lack of support, lack of guidance, feeling invisible in your family, feeling like your needs don't matter, being parentified and having to take care of your younger siblings more than you should. I mean, there's so many facets to that alone. And a lot of times people have both. If they have trauma, they also have neglect. And this is because parents just could not show up in whatever ways that were healthy. And or sometimes they did, and then sometimes it was awful, which creates almost worse PTSD, because as soon as the child relaxes and thinks it's going to be okay, and dad's not going to yell, or mom's not going to hit me, or mom's not going to lock herself in her bedroom, something happens. And so for kids in traumatic or neglectful environments, avoiding certain situations, avoiding certain emotions, and or people can be a means of immediate survival. By steering clear of triggers that could lead to further harm or distress, it makes sense. Kids learn how to protect themselves. Avoidance helps manage their overwhelming emotions. I mean, trauma and neglect often leave kids feeling intense fear, intense sadness, anger, and shame. So avoiding situations or thoughts that are going to evoke these emotions becomes a way to regulate their emotional state. Does that make sense? There's no one around, usually, aka healthy grown-ups, to help them sort through those feelings and validate those feelings in a safe place. And so they have to do something, then that's what they do. They avoid. They push it away. They stuff it down. They pretend it doesn't exist. They disassociate. And they're fine, quote unquote. And so there's also a lack of safe emotional expression, because in a healthy environment, kids learn to express their feelings and needs openly, like that 4-year-old I just talked about. But in a traumatic or neglectful setting, showing emotions can really lead to some negative consequences, even if it doesn't happen every time. What we do know is that if there is punishment or further neglect, it only has to happen a couple times to be possible in their brain. So kids learn to avoid expressing their true feelings. Do you see how we talk about here on the show, this is how a child disconnects from the self. The disowning of the self begins here. And so what are the long-term effects of this avoidance? Well, as kids grow, the habit of avoidance can solidify, and it often does. And it leads to big difficulties in facing and processing their own emotions. They can end up with emotional numbness and or the inability to handle stress effectively. Makes sense. Their body's holding on to these emotions, and it can only hold on for so long before something gives. So, of course, there's relationship challenges. It's going to impact their relationships because they struggle with intimacy. They struggle with honest, open communication. Forget conflict resolution. Can't happen. I mean, that fear of vulnerability can really lead to some superficial connections that they think aren't superficial at first. But it really keeps them from forming deep, meaningful relationships. So I think what I've witnessed is they often seek out people who can't do that either, so no one's talking about what's missing for a while until the other person becomes unhappy and or they become unhappy. One of the things I've seen working with couples for a long time is a lot of times the person who steps out of the relationship and or acts out in other ways has big avoidant tendencies. And that makes sense. They can't get in the ring with their partner and have boundaries and say, hey, this isn't working for me, or I need us to work on this or change that. They sneak out, right? Like the teenager at night and say, that's all right. I'll go get needs met somewhere else. I won't deal with the problems in my marriage. I'll just pretend they don't exist and I'll go somewhere else and start up something out there. So they end up being oftentimes the child in their relationships because kids would rather run away and not deal with things. There's procrastination and task avoidance. So, of course, when there's work or personal responsibilities, there's habits of putting off tasks that can stem from, and this is important, their deep-seated fear of failure, of criticism, and or the unknown. Think about that trauma response. This freeze and fawn that's happening. The people pleasing, the fawning, and the freezing, the avoiding. Self-protective because they don't feel safe. And if they don't feel safe, they're not going to be able to handle the shame. Because if you think you're the only one that struggles with something, your shame's going to come up. Which is why you hear me encourage you on the show all the time, don't do this work alone. You need people around you to support you and let you know you're not the only one and you're not crazy. So parents who can be overprotective and or emotionally unavailable foster avoidance behaviors because either they're not there for the kids' needs and or feelings, or the kid really fears repercussions from expressing them and expressing what they need and what they like and what they don't like and having boundaries. And so there's a big fear of confrontation and emotional expression, which feeds the people-pleasing and the emotional dishonesty. So people-pleasing, which we've talked about in other episodes on the show, I won't get into them too deep here, but, it starts as parent-pleasing. Seeking approval and validation from your caregivers is for your survival. You needed to do that. You needed to have it. And if you didn't, if the vibe came across to you as a kid that, if you get straight A's and don't talk back and clean your room and be compliant, you can have my love as a parent. Maybe you won't upset the whole family. Maybe you won't start a fight, which is going to end up really awful between the other parent and I. The list is endless. Whereas if you set a boundary and you said, no, I don't really want to eat that tonight, and it goes south, you learned not to be assertive. You learned not to ask for what you need and or trust that it's going to be okay when you ask for what you need and that you can negotiate in healthy ways. So imagine how that impacts your adult relationships. What about the emotional dishonesty? Because I think it's a big piece that we don't talk about enough. There's a direct correlation between avoidance and emotional dishonesty because if you can't be assertive and direct and ask for what you need and say no in healthy ways, you either have to lash out and become really aggressive and make it a power play, or you have to be passive aggressive. So then you have to be snarky and you have to be sarcastic and you have to say, forget it. Don't worry about it. I'm fine. You have to be dishonest and lie about what's really going on for you in the moment. You cannot be vulnerable. You cannot put it out there. You cannot risk conflict, risk rejection, risk failure, risk all the above. But you got to get needs met, right? You hear me say all the time, you're going to get them met in healthy ways or unhealthy ways, one or the other. And so maybe you're going to procrastinate and not do that thing for that friend because you're secretly pissed at her. But you couldn't tell her, you couldn't work it out with her, you couldn't be honest. You couldn't say no to something, you said yes instead, and you lied, you were emotionally dishonest, and now you're wrapped around the axle because you don't have time to do that thing you said yes to. So there's lots of different examples of emotional dishonesty. But the big one, which goes with people-pleasing, is, I can absolutely do that for you. I can take care of it. You're right, we should do that. Oh boy. And then not follow through. When I work with couples, this is a huge chronic issue that I deal with at least a couple times a week. It is so common. It ruins the trust in a relationship. It's a big deal. Not following through, not being honest, not saying no when you mean no and yes when you mean yes, makes you untrustworthy, makes you unreliable, and worse, it hurts your self-esteem and diminishes your own trust in yourself. And like I said a moment ago, it makes it really hard to negotiate needs in your relationships. And so what you typically end up doing instead is stuffing your feelings and stacking your resentments, and then you end up lashing out. Because it has to go somewhere. The self is like, wait, we need validation. This is not okay. They've hurt our feelings too many times. They've been late too many times this week. They've let me down. All the things. And so what can happen are unexpected outbursts. Like you're not even planning it. It just blows up. And all this anger and frustration, and you kitchen sink it. You know what I'm talking about, those of you who struggle with this. And you totally feel like the victim. And as you're going through however long you're stuffing your feelings, you're piling on. And then your brain, which is wired for negativity, is going to add more and more things to it. Almost to the point of embellishment, making it a little worse than it really was. Assuming, here's a big one, assuming motivations and motives for the other person. That they must have done that on purpose, or they must really hate me, or they don't care, or just all the things. It's very reactionary. And usually also when you're feeling lots of shame and not good enough yourself, maybe some awful guilt that you don't know what to do with. Others have all the control. And so you lash out at others and project all that nasty you're feeling onto them because you don't know how to do anything else. So you have that cycle of avoidance, suppression, explosion, then more avoidance, then suppression, explosion. All the rescuing and the people pleasing instead of setting boundaries and taking care of yourself. So that is why I tell clients all the time, and you've heard it here on the show as well, it's a whole paradigm shift to do things differently. And we need to learn how and what to do differently. What does that look like? And what do I say, Mary? I mean, people ask me this all the time. I think we can all hear about, yeah, you need to set boundaries, you need to do this, but then what keeps people stuck and then embarrassed to ask is, how do I do that? And that's one of the biggest reasons why I built the big course, because we talk about how to do that. Like, what does it really look like in the moment? And when I work with relationships, we do a lot of role play and a lot of working through and coaching and modeling so that they can get a sense of what to do instead. So if you struggle with any of this that we talked about today, how do you start changing it? Well, first, before you get to practicing new behaviors, you have to create a lot of self-awareness and reflection. And please do this with compassion. If you don't do this with self-compassion and grab the larger context of maybe why you struggle with avoidance, you're going to have so much shame and guilt come up. I think it's going to keep you from doing the work. You're going to do what you always do, which is what? Avoid, right? Push it away. I'll deal with that later. And so looking at your patterns of avoidance and understanding why they make sense as defense mechanisms, as poor coping. But coping, they help you survive. And if you came into avoidance patterns in adulthood, you created them in childhood for a reason, and you have to go back and look and unearth and heal. And that's why I'm doing this episode today, so we know that this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. So creating that self-awareness, journaling, talking to some safe people, do some coaching around it. If you have trauma back there, definitely some therapeutic work. Groups are really good for this support. And along with whatever trauma therapy you might need, then it's changing behaviors. How do you build emotional resilience? Well, compassion is a big deal when it comes to building resilience. And so we also know is that you having a couple trusted friends, maybe a family member or two that's gotten healthier, support groups, safe places make the biggest difference, because that is where you're going to learn how to express and work through emotions, if nothing else. You have to have it. And then gradual exposure. When you're ready, you can work on gradually working up the courage in a safe way to face things, to say what you need, to say no, to practice boundaries, to not rescue, to work on your people pleasing. A little bit at a time. I tell clients do a little bit at a time, because when you do that, you build resilience, you build confidence, and your brain actually changes over the long haul. The other reason why I built the course is to focus on assertive communication. Like, what does that look like? What does it mean to communicate your needs and boundaries in healthy, loving, caring ways, not reactive F you kind of ways? We can start there, but we don't want to stay there. So we need patience, self-compassion, and lots of support, because it takes courage to face danger and know that it's going to be okay, and know that you can take care of yourself, and you're not going to die, and you're not going to be rejected, and you're not going to be abandoned, and you're not going to be an awful person. And nothing horrible is going to happen. There might be some letting go of unhealthy people. There might be some moments, but that is also why it is so crucial that you have safe people around you to catch you when you let go of the unhealthy person, when you step back from your family, when you end some really toxic friendships. You need a place to go. That is the other reason why I really like doing the Facebook Lives every Wednesday night in the Facebook group, because it's a private place where like-minded people hang out and talk about this stuff. And if you're not in there, get in there. It's a very healthy group. I moderate it very carefully. I only let people in who vibe with everyone else and who are serious about working on themselves. It's a great way to hang out every Wednesday evening and talk about these things and get encouragement and support and accountability and learn from each other. So today we talked about how our childhood experiences shape avoidance behaviors in our adulthood, especially if there has been trauma and or neglect, because these early life experiences taught us how to avoid conflict, how to not deal with and or stuff our difficult emotions, and shy away from challenging situations because we're trying to cope and we're trying to be safe. But unfortunately, these avoidance behaviors follow us into adulthood as ways of coping, right? Ways of doing life. And then they manifest as people-pleasing tendencies, lots of emotional dishonesty, and stuff in our true feelings. This can have all sorts of impacts, which we talk about here in all different episodes, like anxiety and depression and all the things, and really strains our relationships. Because eventually those emotions are going to come to the surface and we're going to lash out, and then we do damage. And we talked about how understanding the roots of our avoidance, we can begin to unravel these patterns and work on adopting healthier coping mechanisms. Maybe we need some trauma work done. Maybe we just need some coaching because we've done that work, but we know we need to do some different behaviors. If you're struggling, don't try to fix this by yourself, please. Get some support, grab one of the courses, get in the Facebook group. If you need coaching, I'm here. If you need trauma work, I can certainly talk to you about what to look for in a trauma therapist and find a great place for you to connect. All right. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I hope this was helpful. If it was news to you, that's good. If it's just a reminder and a confirmation that, yeah, you might struggle with this, but there are good reasons, and you're not alone. I hope it helped. All right. So pay it forward. Keep focusing on you, and I'll see you next time.
We hope you took away some useful insights and tools you can begin using right away. If you did, please leave a positive review and share on your social media. Because could you imagine if everyone in your life really got it together? Remember, own it now, so you can really own it later.